And I think I'm live. Who's out there? Is there anybody out there? I start every single one of these this way. That's okay. Somebody checking in from California. Good morning. It's hopefully coffee in hand. So, anybody else? I think we got six people in here for a last minute impromptu session. This was not scheduled. This was just, figured why not? I felt like chatting to some people. So, anybody? There we go. There's two people. How are we all doing today, guys? Somebody put something in the comment. I feel like I'm talking to myself. There we go. A few more people here. So really, as I said, this is rather impromptu, a little bit last minute. Nothing particularly planned for this. I don't have a little presentation. I don't have a little spiel to give for once in my life. I'm going to talk, but I don't have a real formal structure or anything. It's Christmas is wrapped up. I think whether you're a Gregorian or a Julian at this point, Christmas is now wrapped. My Christmas tree, which is just over there, is still up, but hopefully won't be up for too much longer. We'll be taking that down later today. But I just wanted to come on here, say hello to everybody. Welcome to the future. So far, it's rather disappointing. I was hoping for flying cars or peace, or I don't know, wishful thinking on all counts there. But I want to say Happy New Year to everybody, and make sure that everyone for those who had the opportunity to take some time to celebrate and enjoy the holiday season, all those things. There's questions already. Somebody asking, what's my dog's name? That's the dog that you can see, which is that dog right there, the lazy one sitting on the couch. Her name is Lady. Her full name is Lady Barkington III, which is a terrible, terrible joke that was never intended to stick, but managed to. We just call her Lady, and she is an ornery, horrible dog. We love her to bits. We've had her for 4 years. She's a rescue from Greece. And actually, people are commenting saying that they enjoyed the Cyprus video yesterday. That's my dog, Lady. She's from Greece. Over on this side, you can't see him because he's lying down. I have another dog named Grover, and he's a rescue from Turkey, which, obviously, I think I made this joke the last time that I was live, and the dogs were, sort of getting up to things. We really do expect them to fight constantly over like some third part of the house that we can't see, or get a third dog or something. They don't fight. They actually get along really well. But Greek and a Turkish dog. So dog's name is Lady. The other one's name is Grover. So question from Joachim Gonzalez. Where am I from? I am Canadian. I live in the Toronto area. I'm Canadian. So that's for all the people and all the comments that I read that, I'm an American piece of trash. And I see that comment a lot. I am not an American piece of trash. I am a Canadian piece of trash. There is a difference. There's a border. We're different trash altogether. So someone just asked me something there that I thought caught my eye, and I missed it. Oh, do I travel to post-Soviet countries much? From Tony. You know what? No, I haven't. I have not been to a post-Soviet country since the late 90s, actually. That was Russia. I spent time in off and on, continued extended time in Moscow. And I haven't been back. And it's cost and kids and house and like all those life things that sort of get involved. I would love to go back to the post-Soviet sphere. I was actually pricing tickets to Tashkent the other day. That's really, really expensive to go to Tashkent from here. Certainly more money than I have at the moment. I am a poor student, so there's not a lot of, my dollars and cents are certainly spoken for in terms of family obligations and whatnot. As much as I would love to go back and travel back in post-Soviet sphere, whether that's Eastern Europe, whether that's like Central Asia. I've never been to Central Asia. I'd really, really love to go to Central Asia. Tashkent, it's Kazakhstan, wherever that happens to be. I'd love to go to Bishkek. I've been interested in going to Kyrgyzstan since for like 25 years. So yeah, it's Unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity to go back, but would really, really like to. So that's prove she's from Greece. See if she eats turkey. That dog will eat anything. I understand that that's a joke on the whole Greece turkey blah blah, blah thing, but literally both of these dogs will eat anything. That's they are rescues. They both spent time living on the street. One the streets of like Athens, and the other one the streets of like Istanbul. They eat anything. Like they're not particularly picky. They really don't care. Garbage, whatever. So, that's Eaton. Thoughts on the impact of NGOs during the Cold War? That's an interesting question, and especially as to what you count as an NGO. Like, do you consider, and toss your answers, like your opinions on this, guys, like into this. Do you consider the UN to be an NGO? It should be, but the UN as like this administrative body, and especially if you think of it during the Cold War, it's a different beast now than it was during the Cold War. But the UN does act as an NGO. I mean, does it have its own agenda? Probably yes, during the Cold War period. Less so, I think, different than certainly how it operates or doesn't operate now. NGOs are interesting. Like, how do you count the UN? Like, do you look at the Red Cross? Like, do you look at Red Crescent, etc. World Food Program? Like all these, there's so much that has these UN connections that don't seem to necessarily operate within what we think of as the traditional bounds of the United Nations, but still are. It's an interesting idea. Like, actually, I'm going to scribble that down afterwards and sort of have a think about how we can incorporate talking about NGOs, because the NGO stuff does get really interesting. There's very few NGOs that are truly non-governmental. They don't have direct connections, but so many of them receive various funding from national governments. And how does that impact, the role that they play and what they do? That's a really interesting question. Green Cooper, what are my thoughts on ancient aliens during the Cold War? My thoughts on ancient aliens during the Cold War are exactly my thoughts on ancient aliens during any other time period. Enough said. Video idea, UN through the Cold War. We did a pair of videos very, very early on the sort of like how the UN was founded. And we did one from sort of how the Soviets looked at it and how the Western allies looked at forming the United Nations. And we haven't really come back to the UN. I actually feel really bad about that. The UN has, especially in the last 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, has taken this really weird turn where people forget, a lot of people just forget that the UN even exists. During the Cold War and into the 90s, like the UN was this massive thing. It held real importance. It held real moral weight and value, believe it or not, for anybody who's old like I am will actively remember this. Going back and taking a further look at UN stuff is something we definitely need to do. And because I really would like to illustrate sort of some of that, how much more weight and impact UN opinion had on the actions of countries. And peacekeeping stuff. Peacekeeping as a Canadian, obviously, peacekeeping is a thing that Canadians were heavily involved with, etc. I'd really like to go back and take a deeper look at that. So, yeah, I think that's a really good idea, really good suggestion. Let's see what else. The Lebanese Civil War and the Battle of the Hotels. We're going to come back to Lebanon. We did the first Lebanese Civil War. I think that was 1958 with the U.S. Marine deployment, etc. We did that. We're going to come back to Lebanon because obviously the Lebanese Civil War that breaks out later plays a really huge, has this massive destabilizing effect in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. It impacts American actions in terms of, again, Marine deployment, the barracks bombing, like all of those things. So Lebanon we'll come back around to it. I don't know exactly when. We're not necessarily as 100% tied to the timeline stuff. Some people have noticed this in terms of how we're moving things around. We are trying to move away from the 1940s finally after almost 4 years. But we're sort of going to we did the Damansky Island, Zhenbao Island incidents last week. And that pushed us up to 1969. So, we're going to try moving a little bit away from this like really strict timeline. structure. Still try to hit like big things, like big events, like, Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, Prague Spring, like these really big events. We're going to hit those in chronological order, but we're going to try picking out smaller, like other necessarily non-major related events and try to fit those in sort of like, interesting patterns. So or no patterns. So we'll see. Let's see what else. Thoughts about Freemasonry during the Cold War. I don't even know where to go with that. I mean, if you believe that Freemasons rule the country and there's this, secret organization that's controlling all the strings and all those things, then, what can I tell you? Were the Freemasons involved in controlling the Cold War? Like, I don't know. It's a secret organization. Like, if you know the handshake, you can go in and ask the brothers. That's people asking wacky UFO culture during the Cold War. That would be looking at Operation Blue Book, which I'll be honest, I don't know if I want to get into the whole wacky UFO culture thing, because that opens the door into I don't want us to turn into the History Channel. We try to keep things relatively educational in terms of what we're doing, and suddenly the next thing we know, it's just me in a pawn shop. It's the best I can do is $5. I don't want that to happen, so I'm terrified of going the whole ancient aliens and that kind of route. So we will rest in peace, History Channel. Yeah, the History Channel, believe it or not, used to actually show history things, and then they slowly moved away to showing Hitler and Nazis blowing up, which was okay, but that wasn't really like this wider history thing. And then suddenly, after 11, it was how Hitler collaborated with aliens, and to create Wunderwaffe, and the next thing it's ice road truckers and Pawn Stars all the time. And then I cut cable and I have no idea what's on there now. So yeah, that's Cold War pawn pickers. Yeah, exactly. That's it. Just I don't know what happened. That as people have said, it used to be a good channel. Yeah, these things, TLC, once upon a time, like the learning TLC, the learning channel. That's actually what it originally stood for. In the early 90s, used to show actual documentaries, and then that Kate plus 8 minus somebody else, I don't know, whatever that show was, that took over, and then suddenly TLC was absolute trash. And then History Channel sort of chased those numbers and followed it. And oh well, that's such as it is. So I'm the new Chumley. That's where's the ban button? Let's see if I can just sort of actually there is a ban button, Leo. So it's a don't call me Chumley. That's I don't care. Call me what you want. Believe me, I've seen far worse in the comments. Whatever. I'm not going to say whatever you guys can dig up here, but I've seen I've been called some awful things. Some really awful things. So just recently, that's yeah, where was I? I'm sort of rambling. This is what happens when I don't take notes and don't have some sort of a like a schedule or like some sort of an agenda to run. I'm just sort of reading through questions. If I miss your question, I do apologize. I'm probably missing a ton of people's questions. Yeah, but feel free to sort of pop it in there again. Hopefully I catch it. If I don't, I do apologize. Yeah, that's my impartial. Thank you for your impartial reviews. Oh, compliments. Channel has great production and content. You seem like a great historian without the sensationalist approach. Full credit. I mean, obviously, I'm the only person from the channel that you guys see. There's a really big team of people behind me that help bring this out every week. Between it's like Ilkin and Nerlin, who are 2 producers. These guys are all in the credits. Ilkin and Nerlin, who are the 2 producers. We've got a team of researchers, and it's a fairly wide spread out team of researchers and writers. To myself, there's a couple of animators that we work with. To bring this content to you guys every week. It's a really big, deep team, and I'm the face of things. And I sort of put myself out here. I'm not sure why I do this sometimes, but I do it. But none of this happens without everybody coming together and working together in terms of, picking script topics to, getting maps together to, finding B-roll and putting it all together and proofreading and sort of going through all this and recording and all the post. It's a really big, deep operation. And we actually all really enjoy doing it most weeks. It isn't. Thank you very much for the compliments. Please don't direct them to me. Please make sure that you're directing them to everybody. And keep in mind, it's a really big team. They all deserve far more credit than I can ever possibly give them. I only look good. Sometimes I don't even look good, but I only look good because of the work that they do. So that's really, I have to stress that. I can't stress that enough. Oh, look at that, Nurlan, who is in the comments there. He's the head honcho. His basement actually has our studio, so I go to his house every couple of weeks and we record. But he's actually in the chat right now. So hey, Nurlan, I missed our meeting this morning. Can we do something about India, Pakistan, Indian independence, Bangladeshi independence, Kashmir? We've done a few videos looking at the Indian subcontinent. We did not the greatest video on partition and Indian independence. So that's one of those ones that I'd like to actually go back and redo. But we then followed one with an actual war in the 47-48 war in Kashmir, 48-49. The initial war, war of partition, over Kashmir. We did a video not too long ago on that. And I think that was much more in line with our new improved standards of what the channel is trying to do. And we want to keep moving forward with more India subcontinent focused videos, whether that's the Sino-Indian War, Bangladeshi War of Independence, all of that. I want to take a look at Sri Lanka, and just it's a region of the world that I'm not going to say that it gets neglected. I think it gets neglected by a lot of Western historians. It's a really deep and sometimes complicated history. And I'll be honest, it tends to fire some very, very nationalist views from everyone who's involved in whatever the history happens to be. And sometimes that can actually be really unpleasant to moderate. Sometimes the truth is not what people want to hear, and they get upset, and it's sometimes that garbage is a lot to deal with. I'm not trying to say that we're shying away from things because it's difficult. History should make you uncomfortable. That's the truth. I've seen T-shirts with that on it, and I really should get one myself. But history should make you uncomfortable. The truth isn't all the happiness and butterflies and rainbows and princesses and unicorns. It just isn't. But we're still people, and there's still a toll that exacts. That that when people call you trash enough times, within a 5-minute period of time, that maybe I really don't want to necessarily tackle this quite now when there's a different topic that is more fun and a little bit more lighthearted to deal with. So that's but all of that being said, we are definitely going to be coming back to more to subcontinent history, because it is actually really interesting, provided that it's done well, like anything. So that's Stefan. I don't know who stole your unicorns, but lay off the drugs, man. That's or share, one or the other. So a video about the 1964 military coup in Brazil. That would be really interesting. Latin America is another region that we haven't done too much work with. As we're moving forward in our rough-ish timeline, we're actually getting closer to dealing with more and more Latin American subjects. We looked at the Dirty War, the Mexican Dirty War, a couple of weeks ago. And that one actually, surprisingly, because we look at the numbers in terms of how many people, what viewership numbers and engagement, all those things are. Because at the end of the day, keep in mind, this is a business. So we look at those types of things, and we look at the subjects that we think are going to do well, some of them that we know aren't going to do well, but we want to cover anyways. The Mexican Dirty War was one that I didn't think was going to quite get the traction that it did. It got some really good traction for us. And it was a really interesting subject on a topic that I don't think a lot of people know about. But coming back, obviously, that's Mexico, but there's several military juntas that happened across Latin America, whether it's Brazil, Chile is the famous one, but Argentina, Uruguay, there's a lot of Cold War, anti-communist, U.S. supported or supported, sponsored, money funneling. There's a lot of shady stuff. I was going to use a different word. There's a lot of shady stuff that happened throughout Latin America, and we're getting much closer as we get into the 60s and the 70s when all of those things are really, really heating up. So we're going to be trying to address a lot more of that going forward. Hopefully, you guys stick with my terrible pronunciations on a lot of things, and it's like enjoy the work that we're doing in terms of some of these topics. A video on Australia and other allies' involvement in Vietnam. Yes, absolutely. But to be perfectly honest, we have barely touched any American or even French involvement in Vietnam. That's another topic that we really need to sink our teeth into. And that's a huge topic unto itself. Or it might not be. We might not go super into depth on all kinds of different aspects. There's a ton of material out there to work with on Vietnam. There's multiple channels out there that's all that they deal with. And there's years and years of content that are being produced simply on sometimes like a 5-year period in a certain region of Vietnam. There's so much material out there. We have to be careful that whatever we're doing, we're being true to the sources, but we're also, and true to the history, but we're also, not getting too into the weeds and too in depth in terms of these sort of little niche things, because there's sources that we can work with. It's a difficult balance to strike, because there's a ton of stuff that I would love to get into with Vietnam, and lots of little itty bitty things and sort of things that you start picking away at. It's like a sweater, right? You start picking away at a thread, and the next thing you know, there's just this giant pool of like yarn, and there's no sweater left. We still need a sweater at the end of the day. So it is interesting. Mike Domo, the role of Australian forces in the war is really interesting. It absolutely is. Between the Australians and the South Koreans, in terms of the combat roles that they filled, really, really interesting roles that they took on, and very different roles from the American soldiers, the regular American soldiers that were involved. So that's definitely a subject area that we're going to need to get into. Just really haven't quite figured out the angle that we're going to take on Vietnam. So that's on. Here we go. Of course, everybody starts talking about movies. And, Hunt for Red October always comes up. That's one of my favorite Cold War movies, like hands down. That is a fantastic movie. That's also one of those movies that I know that if I can always put on, and it doesn't matter what else is going on, I can put it on. My wife's not going to complain that I've put on a Cold War movie, because she loves the movie as well. So there's that added benefit that I know that I can always put that on, and I'm not going to get any disagreement fighting over the TV or something. So there's yes, exactly, Chris. One ping only. So that's they've lost another sub. Excuse me. War Games in 1983. War Games is a fantastic movie. That is Ali Sheedy and Matthew Broderick. It is just a phenomenal movie in terms of capturing that whole I use this word a lot when we talk about movies, but capturing the zeitgeist of the period, in terms of nuclear, of mad theory, and deterrence, and it's all of those things. I've spent the last couple of weeks doing a ton of reading on U.S. atomic strategy in the 1950s, like evolution in the 1950s. And that's the movie that kept springing through my head. There's this 25-year gap between the theories in the 50s and sort of where it resulted and sort of highlighted so well in War Games. But that's really that's absolutely the movie that kept running through my head as I was reading these articles. So that's Cold War sports rivalries. We did a video a couple of years ago now on the Hungarian football team, soccer for the Americans that are in the room. The Hungarian football team from the 1950s. That's probably one of the single best national football teams that's ever been put together, that should have won a World Cup that never did. And I thought it was going to do so well because it's football, and we all love football, right? We all love football. We hate FIFA, love football. It's football, it's Cold War rivalry, it's direct impact of the Soviet invasion of in 56, like all of these things. And the video really didn't do particularly well. And I'm not blaming people out there for not watching it, maybe a little. It's one of my favorite videos that we ever did. And it really didn't get any traction. It makes me wonder, it's like how much more time, money, and, time do we want to invest in themes that I don't think are really not going to get the wide traction that we need and want. Which is too bad, because it's one of those, it's not that we're chasing the money necessarily, but we do need to remain solvent. We all have, bills to pay. I have to feed those dogs. I have kids too, but I've got to feed those dogs. The dogs are the important ones. So sports rivalries are really interesting. And you get the hockey rivalries. There's these really big football rivalries. Gymnastics turns into this massive thing. We really need to come back to it and try maybe a different angle, a different theme. I don't know, but that's the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, the Miracle on Ice. There's all these different sort of aspects to it. So it's one of those themes that we need to sort of come back to. But we definitely got bitten by that the Hungarian football one. For anybody who hasn't watched that one, please go watch it. Please give it some love that it deserves. And there's some great footage of goals being scored, which is just, I love I love firing up YouTube sometimes and just sitting and watching great goals being scored through history. I can watch that Roberto Carlos free kick over and over and over and over and over again. For those who know, if you know, you know. So that's I've been going on a lot about that. Chess is a really big one of these really big unexpected battlegrounds, I guess. If it isn't unexpected, but it's not one that necessarily for people not familiar with it, it might not be one of the first rivalries that you think of and as a sport in terms of where East meets West kind of thing. But Kasparov and Fischer and all of that, Spassky, all of these guys, it is a big facet. The Summit Series, of course, Riley, that's the Summit Series is a huge thing in Canadian history, obviously. Huge. I've spent my entire life listening to, it's the Summit Series, the Summit. Anyways, I'm now sounding like a terrible Canadian for kind of poo-pooing on the Summit Series, but people wouldn't be talking about this. I can assure you that the Soviets weren't talking about the Summit Series the same way that Canadians talk about the Summit Series. It's important to us. It's not important to other people. It's that two sides of the same coin, right? So, that's what else do we have here? That's people telling me that they love the channel. Excellent. Thank you very much. That's what else do we got? There's should just have another drink, right? That's what's in this. What's in my mug? That's what else is going on out there, guys? Who's had I don't know, somebody dropped me a question here. Actually, there's lots of questions. Oh, Stefan's mentioned Threads. The 1984 British film Threads. That is, I've talked about this before on a live stream a couple of months ago. That is one of the, Stefan has described it as kind of heavy. That is a movie that haunts my dreams to this day. There are scenes from that are burned into my brain. It's absolute nightmare fuel. Phenomenal film. Absolutely amazing and super raw and just really heavy and hard and dark and just it's you don't feel like doing much after watching Threads. But yeah, that is a fantastic movie. It came out right around the same time as The Day After. And The Day After has this reputation as being super, it was really graphic, etc. Threads makes The Day After look like Sesame Street kind of thing. It's definitely it's definitely worth your time to watch it if you haven't. But yeah, it don't plan on doing anything after watching it. That would sort of be my suggestion. Well, that's an interesting question. What region was least affected by the Cold War? I mean, the Cold War, depending on how you're defining the Cold War, the Cold War has had an impact and an effect everywhere. There wasn't a single region of the globe that wasn't affected and impacted in some way. I would probably hazard to say that Oceania would be the least impacted. But nuclear fallout, radioactive fallout is, that there's certainly a lot of impact from that. Antarctica, not too affected by the Cold War. Antarctica is this interesting, giant demilitarized zone that's sort of territorially divided, and controlled by segments of countries. But yeah, I mean, you could probably make a debate that Antarctica, but because nobody permanently lives there, I always think that it sort of falls outside of the realm of what we're going to talk about. I mean, there's an argument to be made. Somebody advocating that Switzerland was less affected. Switzerland was absolutely affected by the Cold War, but not in any kind of negative way. The same way that Switzerland was absolutely affected by the Second World War. Every fight has to have somebody there to hold the money. And that's Switzerland's job. Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, and there's a couple of other places, and that they're there to hold on to the money. And whoever is left gets to come and pick up the money. That was Switzerland through a good chunk of the Cold War. Switzerland's also, it's neutral ground, so it's good for it's conferences, it's good for spying, it's good for summits. There's a whole bunch of things that happen through Switzerland. It just doesn't have to. When we say affected, it definitely has. I think a lot of us, myself certainly, has a pejorative thought to it. Thinking process that if it's affected, it's bad, versus just that there could be positive effects. Hey, Kristaps from Eastern Border just joined us. Hey, Kristaps, how are you? For anybody who isn't familiar with Kristaps' work, Kristaps he's got a podcast. He's a journalist. He's Latvian, runs a podcast that spent a couple of years talking about, sort of life in the former Soviet Union and what life was like in the Soviet Union. Since February 24th, he has gone full combat journalist and has spent quite an extensive amount of time in Ukraine doing some excellent coverage and some excellent work. And thank you very much, Kristaps. I think you're doing a fantastic job. Keep it up. That's the Eastern Border. For anybody who isn't already listening and subscribing, please do. Kristaps is doing some fantastic work. So, Julio Torres Fernandez would be interested to hear about Spain's role in the 1960s, opening up and getting close to the U.S. So we did, maybe you've seen it already, Julio, we did a video on looking at sort of Spain and its sort of post-Second World War relationship to the West and to NATO, and sort of breaking out from the fascist, phalangist. I'm not going to get into this debate right now, but sort of that move from being aligned to the losing side to a few years later actually managing to get yourself into NATO and hosting bases. And all we did a video covering that. It was actually I learned a crap load from that video. We should come back to Spain, and I think I want to do that, especially in light of how Spain fit into the American war plans. Because there's the base at Rota. There's a whole bunch of U.S. and NATO plans that all involved Spain hosting nuclear weapons as the launching point to attack the Soviet Union. This was through the 50s, before ICBMs really sort of supplanted manned bombers as the delivery systems. That's we should come back to Spain. Just haven't had a chance yet. So Kellen Szymanski asked me if we've got any plans to cover Red Army faction. Yeah, I do. Red Army faction and these other West German anarchist like I don't want to get into the political labels, left-wing terrorist organizations that operated in the 70s, Baader-Meinhof gang in the 70s and into the 80s that were operating. They're really interesting just because of their politics and their sort of the role that they played in really, I don't want to say necessarily escalating, but certainly putting NATO forces onto a much higher domestic footing, like escalation, like defensive position domestically, like disco bombings, like bus bombings, shootings. Like there's all kinds of stuff that was going on. Really quite interesting. So yeah, like we're definitely going to come back to Red Army faction and those groups later on in the sort of the latter half of the Cold War. That's Norwegian black metal dudes, and there's more about Norwegian black metal. I don't get Norwegian black metal. I don't really get. Yeah, it's always sort of this. That's the extreme pinnacle of like it's like things I don't get is Norwegian black metal. I'm going to sound really old and kind of crusty. I don't get it. Like it doesn't a lot of it sounds like noise to me. Like damn, and get off my lawn at the same time. But no, it's yeah. It's interesting because your point there was that Norwegian black metal took images from Baader-Meinhof gang attacks and whatnot, and they sort of transfer them and use them images in albums and videos and things like that. It's really interesting. I always find to see where some of these more weird and esoteric images sort of get carried forward 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And that's what's being drawn out in the present is stuff from 30 and 40 years ago. It's always nice to see this weird little link and again, it's one of those, if you know, but if you don't, you have no idea. So, Carlos El Chacal, Carlos the Jackal. That's yeah, that's a much deeper story than I ever really had a good understanding. And that's something that I don't know a lot about. I've only recently, and by recently I mean probably like the last 12 to 18 months, only really had a better understanding of how impactful and how deep the Carlos the Jackal and that type of organization had on global events. Something that we as the channel need to come back to and really take a deeper look. Just really haven't had the opportunity as of yet. So that's a video about Soviet art that would be really interesting. And I'll be very upfront with people about this. People come and make suggestions. And it's a really good suggestion. Talk about Soviet art, talk about Soviet architecture, talk about movies. I don't have any kind of a background in critical analysis of those types of things. And I know that the point of the channel isn't supposed to be critical analysis, etc. But at the same time, I like to be able to come to you guys as an audience and sort of be able to talk from a position of maybe not necessarily of like expertise, because I'm not an expert in most of the things that I talk about. I talk out of my ass a lot. I'm not an expert, but I'm at least passingly familiar with it. Getting into art and critical analysis of movies and architecture and that realm of things, because it's not something that I have a good deep understanding of how it functions and how to analyze those things. My fear is that whatever that we come and present to you guys in a video is going to be wrong. It's going to be half-assed. It's going to be it's not going to be giving the subject the respect that it deserves. I don't want to be out there insulting to people out there who actually do understand these things. So yeah, while I'd really like to do those things, I'm very gun shy about that. Yeah, that's for anybody who's wondering sort of why we have shied away from tackling a lot of those things. That's the reason why. There's a very specific way to look and to analyze the arts. and I just don't have a background in that. Like I'm a history guy. Like I can politics and military type ish stuff, and that I'm far more comfortable with that. I like looking at art. Like I like watching movies, but I don't necessarily. I'm not the best person to sit there and say like, oh, like it's like you can see by the use of the brush strokes and the brushwork here that they're it's a criticism of whatever. That's not me. So. But I have an excellent fan base here, or a group of people. Kristaps is offering to provide assistance, and I'm going to hit you up on that, Kristaps. So brace yourself. Here's the crossover we've all been hoping to happen, right? So, yeah, that's the effect of international shortwave broadcast on both sides. Yeah, like that actually is an interesting topic. We did an episode a number of years ago at this point, looking at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and shortwave, and sort of like how the role that it played. Yeah, and I'd like to come back to it because that obviously that it changes as the Cold War goes on, and there's more additions to it. You get like Radio Marti in broadcasting from Florida into Cuba, and you get it's Radio Berlin. Like there's all these different shortwave broadcasts that get set up. I think, what was I reading somewhere, that North Korea still does shortwave broadcasting, or maybe they just recently stopped shortwave broadcasting. I can't remember, but it was something about North Korea where they're still doing Cold War era broadcast technology. Yeah, like really just some makes me want to, like, I'm not actually going to do this, but makes me want to like go find and tune in and listen to see what does North Korea have to say at this point, just because I think that kind of stuff is whack. Do I know of any Canadian Special Forces missions that I can talk about? Robert or Robert, that I can talk. I appreciate the addition of that I can talk about, because it makes me sound like that I participated in some Canadian Special Forces missions, and yes, I'm aware of them, and I simply can't talk about them. Which, if anybody who's ever met me, I'm the farthest thing from any kind of Special Forces thing. I don't know of any in particular that that I could talk to you about at all, even if there was no Official Secrets Act or anything. No, I'm sure that they exist. Probably, I would guess, probably more so in the last 25 years than during the Cold War necessarily. I'm sure that they existed then, but Canada really used its military other than Germany and Korea, obviously. Canada was very judicious in terms of how it used its military. Obviously, there was Germany and bases there with Lahr and Soest, and there's, I think, one other, Mönchengladbach, and that may have changed at points too. And they were there. It was almost like garrison. It wasn't occupation duty; it was garrison duty, NATO commitments, those types of things. Obviously, the deployment to Korea, and then UN missions. And they're not necessarily the most high. There's not a ton of Special Forces missions that get done on UN deployments, because the UN is usually about keeping people apart and not going out and blowing stuff up. Not always, but however, in the last 20 years, probably since the deployments to Afghanistan, there's a lot more Special Forces stuff with JTF2 and things that have gone on then. I'm sure that there's stuff that existed and that we don't know about, that I don't know about. But my guess is that if what does exist is probably quite limited in scope for the time period that we're talking about. So that's this is a great question, David. What would Kim Jong-un do if his approval rating dropped to 158%? The anti-aircraft guns for everybody. So that's that would be my guess. That's Yeah. When we make videos about Vietnam, that's not about the war, for both North and South. Yeah, and to be honest, like our approach that we're going to take with Vietnam has to include not just the military stuff. It's not just going to be like, it's like, here's the Battle of Bach, and here's, it's like, here's Khe Sanh, and et cetera. It's not going to be that. Like, you can't talk about the American war in Vietnam the way that we're trying to talk about the history of it, without talking about sort of the social impacts and the, like, how the governments functioned, the relationship between the Vietnamese government to the Vietnamese people, the American military, MACV, to to the Vietnamese government, to the Vietnamese people. All of those things, come together. You can't talk about one without the other. So absolutely, we have to look at that. They're inseparable. So that's Hungarian beat boop. I had a Hungarian friend whose dad was doing contract work in Africa in the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, I mean, this is one of these things that a lot of people sort of, we know, we just, we don't, we're not necessarily cognizant of it. Like, we think of, like, I think in the West especially, there's this perception that the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were these prisons and no one was ever allowed out. And that's not the case. People went out and traveled. They might not have traveled to the West, but they were going to places in Asia. They were going to places in Africa, and they were helping with, there was construction projects and, like, contract work and all kinds of different things, trade missions to a ton of places that were decolonizing, and gaining their independence. And the big reason that the Eastern Bloc held so much interest for, say, countries in Africa was because they didn't have any colonial ties. There wasn't this, it wasn't like Ghana, like, that, well, we have to continue trading with Britain. Ghana wants to move away from that trade with Britain because they don't want that, the memory of those unequal relationships, the expectation of those unequal relationships, to continue. It's a fresh, brand new relationship when Bulgaria wants to trade fabric and textiles with Nigeria. That's a brand new relationship there, and that's a good relationship for both of them. So it's not that people in the East Bloc weren't allowed to travel, just that they weren't traveling to the same places that I was at, and where a lot of English sources are coming from. So yeah, it's one of those interesting sort of different aspects to it. Teodora Dragostanova, she's American. She's born and raised in Bulgaria. She wrote a book not too long ago, talking about sort of Bulgaria's relationship to trade ties and whatnot, and cultural communications with lots of the developing world. And it ties exactly into that, what I'm just talking about there, rambling as usual. So, yeah. Do I have any knowledge regarding Dubček and his policies in Czechoslovakia? Not as much as I should, considering that we're getting pretty close to coming up to Prague Spring and all of those lovely events that leading into Prague Spring, like, Operation Whirlwind, Typhoon. I can't think of the name of the operation. August 20th, 1968, where Soviet tanks come rolling in, and it's like, tankies rejoice. And then normalization afterwards. Like, that's something that I've never really done any first to admit, I've never really done any in-depth reading on it. I have to change that, obviously, with subject material coming up. So I'm not as familiar with, sort of that role. For any follow-up questions that you might have there, Kellen, I'm probably not the right person to talk to about it right now. Ask me again in a little bit. That's let's see. Mao from Indonesia. I thought that was going somewhere else, Mao. Do I think that the CIA has something to do with the 30th September movement? Yeah, it absolutely Yeah, that's proven. The military method, the military method used in Operation Condor. I mean, I haven't done it again. Like Operation Condor is a huge, huge topic where there's tons of CIA funding that comes in to sponsor juntas and dogs on the move, to sponsor it's like juntas and to crush anything sort of that resembles the left wing. Yeah, like I mean, I need to be careful how I say this. The CIA is involved in a ton of things during the Cold War, just like the CIA is involved with a ton of things now. The CIA, however, isn't behind everything bad that ever happens. And the reason I'm being careful how I say this is because I see this in the comments a lot. Something bad happened, must have been the CIA. Well, you know what? Sometimes the CIA did some bad things, or they may have gotten the ball rolling, but the CIA wasn't responsible for like the horrible atrocities and everything that happened afterwards. And the Mexican Dirty War is a really good example of just that. Yeah, the CIA was involved in doing some training stuff. There was some funding, but the CIA wasn't the ones that were out there, gunning down people and, dropping people out of helicopters. That was a purely domestic thing. So the CIA, absolutely awful organization doing a bunch of really nefarious and terrible things at a whole bunch of different points. CIA is also a giant administrative beast that, like any administrative beast, sometimes it doesn't know, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, etc. CIA bad. CIA is another government body. CIA doesn't do everything bad in the world. Sometimes people are just horrible. That's the reality of it. And that's me taking a very on the fence position to it, but that's the truth. Operation Condor. Yeah, that's Max Fiero's comment. They should cover Operation Condor one piece at a time. Yeah, like Operation Condor is not going to be like a 15-minute video. Like this is Operation Condor. Like Condor is it's a huge like, I don't want to say it's multi-decade, but it's certainly like a multi-year program that happened, and it played out differently in different places. Like how it played out in Chile was different from how it played out in Brazil, how it played out in Argentina, how it played out, anywhere. Like there's all these different things that all sort of fall under this umbrella of Operation Condor. But no, we certainly have to take that as multi pieces. Like we're certainly not going to try to address that in all together in one 15-minute video. That would be worse. That wouldn't be doing the subject justice, and it's doing everyone a disservice. It's like you and me. So yeah, that's let's see. My other dog has never come on camera. Come here. And he's not going to. Okay, well, so much for that. So, Kellen asking if we have covered Pinochet in Chile. No, we have not covered Allende, Pinochet, in Chile as of yet. That's coming up, but we're not quite there yet. So, the really interesting thing that I find about Pinochet in Chile is when you start looking at the East German relationship to Chile. East Germany and Chile, prior to Pinochet taking over, they had a really strong bond. It was a really deep relationship. A lot of left-wing Chileans actually ended up in East Germany. And that's a really interesting story into itself. There's a podcast, Radio GDR, that has a bunch of good conversations. I think Cold War conversations with Ian. Have done a couple of conversations looking deeper at that role of the Chilean relationship to East Germany and vice versa. Really, really quite an interesting topic. So, yeah, that's. Do I think? So my dog just knocked over the webcam. not the webcam, the light, and that was them barking. It's never a dull moment. So I apologize the way that the lights just sort of went all to crap there. What was I talking about? Somebody just what do I think? Do I think there's a lot of parallels between Stalin and Putin? Yeah, there's parallels because they're authoritarian. Like, do I think that there's parallels between their policies? I mean, there's probably some overlap somewhere, but they're dictators. They're authoritarians. Yeah, there's similarities. You know, it's like birds of a feather. Like there's strategies that get employed, whether you're left wing, whether you're right wing. When you're an authoritarian, totalitarian dictatorship tends to follow the same sort of format there. So yeah, that's somebody just asked me, am I going to do anything on Atomic Kitty? One word, yes. Atomic Kitty is one of my favorite things. I will definitely be doing Atomic Kitty. For those who don't know, Atomic Kitty was a CIA-sponsored program that tried, what's the word I'm looking for here? They tried to basically remote control a cat to turn it into a spy device. And then the paperwork gets a little bit murky, whether like they decide that, this doesn't really work. So, they just sort of squelched it, or if that they actually succeeded in doing it. And the first time they tried doing it, the cat got run over. We'll bring that all up in the episode, but yeah, like mind control cat. Give me 1 second, guys. I'm going to see if I can get this. The light's bothering me. So hang on 1 second. Talk amongst yourselves while I yell at my dogs. There we are. I'm your host, David, and I'm back. Matt, Atomic Kitty might be a 90s, 2000 girl group. I just know Atomic. I am familiar with Atomic Kitty as a failed CIA program. It's a great story. That's, yeah. Let's see. Wow, I step away for a minute and there's talk about dolphins and interspecies romance. You guys are sick. What's going on with you guys? Geez. Somebody recommending On the Beach. Yeah, it's a good book too. He just wants to bark. He doesn't want to come over. Okay, anyways. Yeah, so I don't know. Like I've been sort of like rattling on here for about an hour or so, and this was really only intended to ever be sort of short. A quick little discussion. An episode on Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. Yeah, Sankara is a really interesting guy. Lots of good ideas, like what I think what a lot of people consider to be a lot of good ideas and wanting to do the right thing. And then gets overthrown and murdered before any of that can really get going. And as a result of this short period of time where it's lots of good ideas with no responsibility in terms of actually implementing it, he's looked at as a hero. Sankara is interesting. I personally want to read more about Sankara, but I'm sure that we can hopefully bring something more to you guys as well on Burkina Faso and Sankara. Really is quite an interesting story from everything that I know about it. So, what do these questions? It sounds terrible. Lipa, asking about what I know about the Yugoslavian mega projects and the Yugoslavian military. Was it a serious player? I think Yugoslavia is this. I mean, we've done other episodes on Yugoslavia, obviously. Yugoslavia is this really interesting sort of. It's not caught necessarily. It's positioned itself between East and West. Had a really healthy domestic arms production industry. Was it a military powerhouse? No, it wasn't. Did it have the potential to be a regional powerhouse? Absolutely. Was it ever going to be allowed for that? No. But certainly, the Yugoslav like domestic arms production was well advanced. Like there was some really good, from my understanding, there was a lot of really good small arms and whatnot being produced out of Yugoslavia. Was it? I mean, Yugoslavia was Tito. Tito was Yugoslavia. As soon as Tito was gone, everything sort of began unraveling. The 74 Constitution had a big role to do with that. Rank nationalism coming from all the different nationalisms that exist in in Yugoslavia, all those, and everybody exploiting that to try to gain a power advantage over everybody else, which is how these things always happen. Yugoslavia is this really interesting thing. I think I can't think. It's nostalgia for Yugoslavia. And there's a specific word that my brain's not firing properly to be able to remember what it is. There's this thing where people do. It's like, well, we think back to Yugoslavia, and it's like, oh, it was the good times. They were so happy. We had everything that we didn't have much, but we had everything. Yeah, that's Yugo nostalgia or something like that. But people think back on Yugoslavia, it's like we had everything that we needed. It wasn't much, but it was a good time. Everyone was always so happy, et cetera, et cetera. If you go back 50 years and start asking Yugoslavians what they were unhappy with, they were going to say like, oh, everything's great. We're really happy. They're going to give you this long laundry list of things that they want. Always. The grass is always greener. Things suck now. Things suck differently then. Like it's, I don't know. It's maybe I've been reading too much about history, and there's no happy. No one's ever happy. No one's ever happy. Yugoslavia was this interesting creation. Should it have succeeded? Could it have succeeded? I don't know. Things played out the way that they did. That's really what you can say about that. Like I've said this before in a couple of other live streams. I don't like alternate history. I don't like playing counterfactual because I don't think that there's a lot of benefit to it because it just turns into wish fulfillment. So I really don't like spending time sitting and thinking, well, what if this had happened? Because it doesn't go anywhere except my imagination is going to make it lead to where I think it should have gone and would have been great. And that isn't how history works. Gio Franco asking my thoughts on NAFO. I think a bunch of brain damaged dogs have done a lot of really good things for Ukraine. That's my thoughts on NAFO. So brain damaged dogs for the win. That's excuse me. That's yeah. Thank you. I mean, there's Styles Dempsey asking, saying that he loves the channel. Thank you. Would love to know more about Gorbachev. We will absolutely be doing more on Gorbachev. You can't talk about the Cold War and then ignore him. Gorbachev is the reason that the Cold War ended. I mean, that's all those things. That's on my reading list of things. So if I ever get free time, that is Perestroika by Gorbachev. We will get there. Gorbachev is a fascinating failed leader, an idealist. Like I did a quick little retrospective, sort of a thought piece on him a couple of days after he passed away last year. Yeah, that's a really interesting guy. We'll definitely get more into to Gorbachev, and I want to do more in terms of like why he's looked at with such favor in the West, and he's looked at by many in especially in Russia as being a traitor and a piece of crap, or he's looked at as being an absolute monster in some of the post-Soviet republics. So there's a real split in terms of how people, and the reason why people view Gorbachev the way that they do. Really interesting guy. Have I ever used the 35 millimeter cameras made in the USSR? No, I haven't. I'm not a camera guy. I have my phone that takes sort of, crummy photos as I need, and that's good enough for what I do. But Soviet cameras had a reputation as, the ones where the lenses were ground properly, fantastic quality, like really good level quality cameras. there was certain industries that the Soviets did really, really well. They never did a lot of them because there's obviously the production issues and all those things. But yeah, like the reputation of Soviet cameras and certain other like Soviet optics in general was actually pretty damn strong. So yeah, I've never used one. As I said, I'm not a camera guy, so I wouldn't be able to tell. Except if it was printed on it, I wouldn't be able to tell a Zeiss from a Canon from a. I couldn't even name you a Soviet camera. Like, how about that? I have no idea. But yeah, they were good quality from at pretty decent prices from everything that I understood. So that's yeah. Let's see if there was another. So no 99. If there was another leader in the USSR when the Berlin Wall was destroyed instead of Gorbachev, would World War III have started immediately? Again, counterfactual history. The Berlin Wall came down as the Berlin Wall came down as a result. The immediate thing was an accident from Gunter Schabowski. Accidental speech. He just came back from holiday. It was probably just, he was tired and kind of out of it. Does the Berlin Wall come down? Gorbachev had pledged years earlier that there would be no involvement, in the internal affairs of in the East Bloc countries. But Gorbachev, it happened the way that it happened because not even the right people. It happened the way that it happened because those people were in the positions and took the actions that they did. That's what history is. And there's dozens and hundreds and thousands of moving pieces that all happened exactly the way they did to bring about that one moment. It's the butterfly effect, right? Like, you change one thing somewhere else and it's like suddenly an atom bomb explodes in San Francisco. That's how it happened. I couldn't tell you if there was a different Soviet leader, everything changes. Could the Berlin Wall have come down? Maybe. Do I think it would have? Maybe. I really don't know. It's for anybody who's got ideas and it's like wants write your counterfactual, write your Man in the High Castle, write the book. I'd love to see the thought process. I don't have a good one because I seem to spend far too much of my life looking at exactly trying to figure out exactly how it happened and all those things from the sources that we have available. So that's Sleep Ukraine. Did we ever have an episode on Austria? We did. We did an episode on post-war Austria, why the Soviets withdrew from Vienna. The Soviets withdrew from Vienna. They basically really exhausted everything that they could get out of Austria, and it was in exchange for certain security agreements that were happening elsewhere. It was a good deal and a good trade that they could get from that. So yeah, and it's creating this neutral buffer space. Keep in mind, the Soviet desire for control over those East Bloc countries was not necessarily strictly because they wanted control of those countries, is that they wanted a buffer area, hundreds of miles of buffer region, so that if the Germans, because everyone was expecting that the Germans would be reunited, that if a reunited Germany invaded and attacked the Soviet Union, Russia again, that they would have all this space. That's the reason for it. It's always like that there's 40 years of Cold War history that are specifically influenced and directed by the impact of Barbarossa. That is a huge, huge factor that I think doesn't get stressed often enough. And that's my fault as well. I don't stress that enough, but that's a key frame of mind that the Soviets keep in mind. And you see that through Khrushchev's speeches and talk. You see it through Stalin's, you see it through Brezhnev's. That's a big, big thing. They were all men. They were all adults and men when Barbarossa happened. Gorbachev was a child when that happened. That memory is distant and disconnected There's less connection to it for him. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking through these things. Yeah, that's what else do we have here? Right, Chris G. It must have been a huge concern. It was a huge security concern when you've been brutally attacked, and Barbarossa was that. I mean, and there's no forgiveness for the Soviets for their actions from 39 to 41. But when you're brutally attacked and the losses and the damage that they took as a result of this surprise attack through the Great Patriotic War, that commands your focus on how you expect to defend yourself going forward. Germany was the rival through the First World War, post-revolution, through all of that. Germany was that rival. There may have been alliances of convenience, etc., but there was always that, the Germans were the enemy. It's only really in that post-war period that the Americans sort of supplant that as being the enemy. But and if you read through some of Khrushchev's stuff, his focus and his concern on Berlin was so much still because of this fear of a united Germany. Everything that Khrushchev was doing over Berlin was this idea that he wanted a unified but pacified and disarmed Germany. Which obviously we know didn't happen. So, excuse me. Yeah, and there's a comment. I think that's Professor What? Putin's still looking for a buffer zone. There probably is a high degree of that's impacting and influencing there. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the driving force. Putin is an irredentist to the highest order. I don't necessarily know that I think Putin talks a big game about Russian security, but at the end of the day, it's about prestige and power and position, and getting the boys back together. What's going on in his mind? That's speculative. The only person that knows what's going on in Putin's mind is Putin, and I'm not the expert to be able to say that I know what's happening there. That's my read on things. That's my read on things very much. So, let's see. I am going to have to wrap this up at some point relatively soon, guys. I hopefully people have been having a bit of fun with this, and there's listening to me ramble, and I'm not talking too much out of my ass. But Robert is Monsieur Poulain. He's hoping that I talk about the FLQ crisis. I would like to talk about the FLQ crisis, but I'm not sure how many people are going to tune in to watch about the FLQ crisis. We don't really have a huge Canadian viewership, and outside of Canada, who's interested in the FLQ crisis? That's other than Robert Poulain. Well, okay, there's two people because Stahl just said that he is. The FLQ crisis, for those who don't know, the FLQ was a left-wing independence organization, terrorist organization that went on a mailbox bombing campaign for a good portion of the late 60s and early 70s, I want to say. More in the early 70s. They ended up kidnapping a member of the Quebec Legislative Assembly and a British diplomat, one of whom ended up dead. And Prime Minister Trudeau, Sr., not the current one, obviously, declared the Emergency Measures Act, declared the War Measures Act, and rolled tanks into the streets of Montreal and Quebec, and forcibly put down what was a campaign of terror. And there's this whole thing surrounding the FLQ, and there's, people are making reference in Canada back to the FLQ after the events that happened on Parliament Hill last year, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, will we do the FLQ crisis? We'll see. I'm still not entirely sure where to gauge interest in that. It's it is an interesting piece of Canadian history, but Canadian history is notoriously I shouldn't say it's notoriously boring, because it isn't. There's a couple of people out there that, if they're watching, I apologize profusely. Canadian history actually has a lot of really interesting facets to it. But there's certainly a reputation with Canadian history that it's kind of boring. So depends how much you like politics and reading about statutes and legislature. So excuse me. Yeah. Oh, that's apparently I've just interested a bunch of people. Well, that's Naxalite episode. That's that. If we're gonna do a Naxalite episode, I'm gonna need to learn way more about Naxalites and Maoism than what I know. But that's probably a worthy goal in and of itself. So yeah, I think at this point, guys, I'm gonna need to bail on this. This has been enjoyable for like a sort of a last minute sort of jump in. Hopefully, you guys have had some interesting sort of conversations, or just sort of listening to me, prattle on. People are continuing with suggestions like, Sandinistas, Mongolia, all on the checklist. Absolutely. Yeah, all those things. What is today? Today is Sunday. Yeah, today's Sunday. I've very much lost track of what day of the week it is at any given point. I work from home. I'm basically working for myself and a student at this point, so days of the week don't mean anything. And my wife works shift work, and doesn't have a regular like Monday to Friday schedule. So I absolutely have no idea what day of the week it is at any given time without actually going and physically checking. So, but I think it's Sunday. Please, everyone, go enjoy the rest of the last bit of weekend. For those of you who are enjoying the weekend, if it's already happens to be Monday where you are, well, then happy Monday. And will be hopefully be in your living rooms and in your phones, etc. Next Saturday. And for those who haven't watched our back catalog, please go do that. If you really enjoy the work that we're doing, we do have a Patreon page. Would really, really appreciate any kind of support that you guys might be able to help and to offer. There's a lot of work that goes into these. As I said, this is my job. But yeah, Patreon, if you guys are able and willing, then fantastic. If not, give us a like, give us a share, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell everybody, share it everywhere, get onto Reddit, get into those Reddit groups and start sharing stuff. That's great too. Any kind of exposure is good. And hope you guys all have a great week and be good to each other. Bye guys.